This institute is just also a young thing. It's just founded 1996. And contrary to most musicological departments at universities, it does not see music as an object of research, but it researches music through musical practice itself. So what are our people doing? We are some 35 associated researchers. We're working about musical technology, as you can see on the upper left. We have issues of historically informed interpretation. For example, we have Tom Begin, who's doing work on replicas of Beethoven's own pianos. We also have a lot of published works. We have a series of books, CDs, as well as a MOOC since recently that is quite well attended all over the world. So we research music through music, you could say. So the experimental pragmatic element is key to all the work we do at Orpheus. And just to give an idea of our premises in Ghent, this is our main building. You can see we have our own concert hall. And on the upper right here, this is the future house of the library we're talking about today. It's an 18th century coach house belonging to the beautiful Hotel Dane Steenhuizen, which is an 18th century city palace in the heart of Ghent. And this is where the physical library will be located. The collector of all the stuff we're going to have, thanks to a grant from the Desiree Collin Foundation, is collected by Ton Copeman. And Ton Copeman is one of the world's, let's say, pioneers of HIP, which is historically informed performance in music. The man has been incredibly prolific throughout his life. He has more than 230 recordings to date, some of which are multiple CD box sets. He has a complete recording set of Bach's cantatas, the complete organ works of Bach, the complete works of Buxtehude. So he's immensely active, and still at this day, he's still conducting all over the world, but not at this moment because of the virus, of course. And besides being a great musician, a harpsichordist, an organist, and a conductor, Copeman is also someone who's eager to share his knowledge about the thing he's been practicing all of his life, historically informed performance. As a matter of fact, he's already published a book on Baroque music theory and practice in Dutch in '85, and he's also been very keen to be portrayed alongside his massive library. And now, what is this library about? This is the Copeman house in Bussum, where it still is at the moment. This is the man's own workplace. And this is part of his old, so-called old library, a library that grew so rapidly over the 60 years that he had to add annexes to his own house. It's an amazing collection. It's 5,700 something old prints and manuscripts dating from 1461 until the 20th century. There are lots of beautiful manuscripts, unique things like there's one cantata by Handel, of which he has the world's singular copy. There's also a collection of modern books on music, but also the arts of the Baroque, lots of modern scores, facsimiles of scores, rolls of microfilm from scores he collected from all over the world, and a series of journals. So you could say this almost 20,000 piece collection by a single collector who was a practitioner in music. So when we're getting this collection, of course, one of the first tasks to do is to create an OPAC, an open public access catalog in which people can consult what we actually have. And this is not such an easy task, because what they've been doing at Tom Copeman's house, he had his own librarian, believe it or not, who is using a quite old German program called Allegro C. And this program is, well, a bit compatible with modern standards of cataloging, but not all of them. So what we got, these were exports from the catalog. As you can see, a very brief information, a few metadata. So we had a lot of enrichment to do already in the last months. Just to give an idea, this is where we're heading towards. We do an Aleph catalog in which we at least have information on the languages of the publication. This is very important for musicians. The number of music instruments and the setup of them, for example, the codes for violin, viola, basso continuo, etc. We complete the names of the authors, the composers, librettists, and all that. We create a uniform title, information on the imprints, on the physical description, on the subjects, so that we can group works together along certain groups. And this is quite interesting here. This is a note containing background information on the work in question, plus, and I think we're going towards the digital world, we try to find URLs of works that already exist in digital version somewhere online. And this could be Gallica, this could be Google Books, this could be the German digitization centers, or as we often find it on IMSLP, which is an international music score library. So what we want to do is be smart, and we of course we would love to digitize the whole thing, but before doing that we have to prioritize. Digitization is incredibly expensive and time consuming, so what we want to use and profit from is all the work already done in the world. There's some voice. Just continue. Just an idea, because of adding subjects to all books, you can get an idea of what this library is really about and what its strengths are. And not surprisingly, if you see this word cloud, notated music is a central element. So this is split up in instrumental and vocal music. But it's definitely not the only one. If you can see here, religion. Copeman has done a lot of vocal works from the Baroque, so quite obviously he's been very interested in collecting works about religious context in which these very works were produced. So he has a lot on Lutheranism, the tradition in which Johann Sebastian Bach works, but he has also a lot of stuff from Catholicism and other religious traditions. So this is a very strong element in the collection that also people from other disciplines can profit of. There's a lot of general history, there's a lot of theater plays in it. The rationale of his collecting was really to create a complete view of the long 18th century in which he was so active musically. So what we're doing with all this information is we bring it online, and in this we have an excellent partner in University of Ghent Library, which has a network called KGWeb, could also pronounce it KGWeb. It means catalog for the Ghent scientific libraries. So it creates this basic view. This is an upload done in December. It's now already expanded a lot. But important is this, that you can have online buttons leading you to digitized versions for those interested in reading the text without necessarily wanting to consult the physical exemplar in our collection. So this collection reports to UNICAT, which is the Belgian catalog of libraries, and then this goes to Google. And I've been surprised that already since December we are finding rare works through Google being reported as existing in our collection. But there's something more, and Huub can tell you more about that. Huub.
Yes. Thank you, Bruno, for this first part. As Bruno already said, Ton Copeman uses his library as a working tool, and one of the key aspects of the way in which he has done that, and to a certain extent continues to do that, is by adding lists of keywords. Usually he puts these in the front of the books. So with the old books, the old printed editions, he writes them on a piece of paper, which he then inserts in the book. And this is one example of a list of keywords from an early biography of Johann Sebastian Bach from 1802. So these are all concepts. Sometimes there are literal words in the text, but the interesting thing is also that there are more abstract, more conceptual things of his interpretation. So things that you couldn't find even if you have a full text, perfectly OCR or other version where you can search for exact words. Even then, some of these keywords are his interpretation, or sort of a word that doesn't appear literally, but that he subsumes from the text. And followed, each of these keywords are followed by the pages in the book on which this term or this concept appears. So obviously this is a very useful resource for multiple reasons. As a practical tool for others, as a way of accessing these books, and in the long term, it also offers a view of how Ton Copeman himself read and to a certain extent interpreted these books. So they offer a view of his way of reading, the things he found interesting. So they even can provide a tool into sort of his readership of his own library. So there's those two parallel aspects. Now, because of the importance of these keywords, one of the things that we want to do in one way or another is make these keywords available to others, which means that they have to be transcribed, made searchable in some way. Because even now there's no general index for these, even at Ton. So he makes these lists for individual books, but they are not then collected into even a card catalog or something. So there's no way of looking for terms across his whole library. And if we can go to the next slide. So the basic problem or issue that we're dealing with could be summarized like this, where we have a number of books with a number of keywords. We just saw an example with a lot of them, but some of the books have only very few of them. And some of them are quite common terms, so they appear in multiple books. And obviously what we'd like to do is make something in which we can search for these keywords and then find in which books they appear, first of all, and secondly, in those books on which pages. So this is sort of the basic problem that we're dealing with, this need to aggregate all of these terms and make them searchable. And if we can go to the next slide. This is a slightly more elaborate schematic overview of what we're now thinking of doing and what we're trying to realize. So on the top, there's a library access portal. We're probably going to implement a customized version of Blacklight, and we're talking with the University of Ghent as well about helping us create a version of Blacklight for our needs. And these will contain, this will enable us and enable other users to search for various things. In the beginning, there's going to be two columns or two groups of information. Obviously, the records for the books themselves, and secondly, the records of this vocabulary of Copeman, and which can be expanded perhaps with new terms that he didn't use or that others within our institute might find useful. And obviously, these two need to be connected in some way. So in the records for the books, we would like to see the keywords, the Copeman keywords that appear in those books, and vice versa in the records, so the URIs for the keywords. We'd like to see in which books those keywords appear. And Bruno already talked about digitalization. So another thing that we're looking at is how we can benefit from the many digitized books that are already out there, and whether we can also let users, so not only our own researchers, but other users annotate these books. And we're talking with Ghent also about making a version of Madoc, which is an annotation tool for digital images. So this is sort of a basic setup of what we would like to achieve. I think we can go to the next slide. So This is obviously a very simple view yet, but just to give some idea of what we'd like to be able to do to search, and perhaps to this we could add specifying the search only to the keywords, so to the thesaurus of terms, or only within the books. There are obviously many things that can be expanded and that we can add to this, and Blacklight has already proven itself in many different contexts to be a good tool to achieve this kind of top level searchability. And if we go to the next slide, this is in a similar vein, a sort of mock-up, a dummy of how these URIs or the pages for the keywords could look, where there's a definition. Perhaps we could indicate that this is a Copeman keyword, so this is one of the keywords that Ton himself used to distinguish them perhaps from other additional keywords that we might add to the books at a later stage. A brief definition. We'd like to perhaps add links to other definitions or more expansive definitions, either in Wikipedia or MGE, which is a large German language music encyclopedia. It's possible to think of adding sound or visual sources to these, so we can sort of enrich these pages for the separate keywords. And then obviously, as I said, a key part is that on these landing pages for the separate keywords, we'd like to be able to see in which of the books these terms were used as a keyword. So this too can be expanded. I added one example, for example, the ICO. After Montesson, we could use something like this to indicate that in this book the term is used to indicate an iconographical source, so a picture, an engraving, a frontispiece that depict. I mean, the tremolo probably doesn't have an image, but obviously we'd have instruments or other concepts that are more likely to be represented in a visual way, and this would enable us, and would enable users to look only for visual sources. Something else that we could think of is who used these terms. So, for example, was it Copeman himself who added this term to a book, or was it a subsequent user, one of our researchers or someone else? So these are all elements that have to be developed further. And I think if we go to the next slide, so I think what it boils down to is our basic, one of the problems that we're, I don't want to say struggling with, but that we're trying to solve in a way, is that we have these three columns in a way. We have this thesaurus or this vocabulary of keywords with their own landing pages and URIs for the specific terms. We have the library catalog records, which in KGWeb also have their own URIs. And then the third aspect are the digitized books themselves. And like I said, there's sort of different steps that we would like to achieve and to make the connection between these three, where we can link the keyword URIs to the book record URIs, but also we'd like to indicate obviously on which pages these keywords appear, and ideally link these directly to the digital page, the digitized page itself. So these are the different sort of gradations of going to an ever more specific connections between these terms, and this is what we're trying to achieve in the end. And I think if we go to the next term, Bruno has some more examples.
Yeah. So why are we doing this? Copeman has done a lot of work on these books. There are a lot of treatises that are lengthy. There are a lot of studies that may be hard for, say, a beginner in HIP performance. So what we try to create is a portal on a world of knowledge. It is, I compare it as we have it now. We get a library, and we get a huge pile of maps with them. And I compare them with these old maps, these foldable maps my parents took when we went on vacation. And my mother would sit next to my father and swap maps when they came on a portion of the map that was no longer visible there because of the strict conditions. So what we create now is a GPS out of these many maps that Copeman has written down for us to create one big knowledge map so that others can profit it. For example, you're a young musician and you have a question. I just 2 weeks ago I had a question. How do you play a trill when you do Bach's music? So, and then I said, well, you have to look up the right trill tables, but because there exist trill tables as a preface to many of these scores. So you have to look it up somewhere. If you have a guide like Ton Copeman saying there's a trill table in a book from the early 18th century in German, this is a lot of help. You don't get in any other location. So just give an idea of what you could get from this information. There's just this yellow field that should not supposed to be there, but I hope you can forgive me for that. So for example, a keyword violin. This can be mentioning the violino in the title, but also an iconographic depiction of a violin, and this can be accurate or not. This is up to researchers to find out. There's also in the same way a cello mentioned here, and this is getting more interesting because the text says violone, not violoncello, and violone is the early 18th century name for a cello. So this is already a translation Tom gives us that cannot be obtained through OCR. More complex, for example, he writes multiple use of the same score. And what he means there is that this score can be used by several musicians at the same time, as the scarabs are doing, playing from these parts. All three of them are looking at the same part. There's also mentioning of the viola d'amore as an instrument, also of using the dampers, the mutes on a violin, sordino. So this is again a translation. There's depictions of bows, but we also could add a lot of additional information. For example, on the dedicatee and Princess Royal, of whom he happens to have many different publications. Tom, she was a patron of Handel's. He has a book on her wedding, a kind of laudatory poem. So we could also use these keywords to connect different works in the library. There's also stuff you could put on the iconographic appearance of the score, for example, the appearance of an eagle, apparition of an eagle, of a part book here, cherubs playing instruments, plants. Good question, is this a generic frontispiece or not? So in short, this is a library that offers us a lot of opportunities because of these maps that are made available with it. And I'm concluding, I think I'm writing down now, with a Baroque citation. Sforza Pallavicino is a Jesuit cardinal who published an important book on Baroque aesthetic in the era of Gian Lorenzo Bernini. It's now often cited as a parallel, a theoretical parallel to the world of Bernini, Borromini, and that time. And Sforza Pallavicino mentions the importance of ingenio, of intellect, which for him consists exactly in joining by way of smart apprehensions, smart ideas, objects that appear to be disconnected, and thus finding relationships between them. At first, when we got this library and I looked at the contents, I thought, oh no, this is so disparate. There's music, there's religion, there's poetry, there's literature, there's history, and so much. But using this system, we have a way to find connections between all these books, and these connections can show us the world of the Baroque, the world that has knowledge that is always folded, as Gilles Deleuze famously wrote in his treatise Le Pli, Leibniz et le Baroque, knowledge that needs to be unfolded again to make this understandable to modern musicians. Hence the title of our project, Resounding Libraries, unfolding archived knowledge through artistic research. In the end, we have this digital portal, and what will come out of it as well are actual performances of music, bringing new connections, presenting new connections between the different items in Ton Copeman's library. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you very much to Bruno and Huub for presenting this beautiful library that will be even more discoverable with this. So I don't know if you can see, so in the chat you've had quite a few questions coming in as you've been speaking. So let me maybe go, so the first one was comments. Nice, historically informed performance, and Patty was saying, oh wow, what a beautiful studio and library Ton Copeman has.
Yes, all agree on that one.
Absolutely. Then Ben's first comment was, it's like an annotation scheme, but with no computer at that stage. So the first question is from Ben. Does the vocabulary Copeman uses in the keywords match up with contemporary academic terms that are currently used?
My impression is, I mean, obviously we have the problem that Bruno said at the beginning, that we don't yet physically have the library with us. So we've been to Bussum, we've looked through the books, but obviously we have a first impression, and I think it's a mix of both. I mean, some terms are, I think, contemporary terms, but I think he also uses contemporary in the sense of like our current way of like the violoncello example that Bruno gave earlier, where Copeman uses violoncello, and perhaps the term from the period would be violone. But he also uses, I think, terms from the period. So there's no, he uses both, and I think he mixes them. And even, like I said earlier, given that there's no master index, even for himself, there's inconsistencies even between one book and the other, and sometimes it's minor things like spelling, and sometimes it's probably going to be bigger terms, but it's difficult at this point for us to get a precise idea because we don't have the books yet.
Yeah, luckily he's a librarian is scanning now all the indices, so we can using the PDFs that exist, we can look at what they try to say. And what we take profit of is that Ton is joining us, our group, for 5 years. So we'll have, I hope, plenty of time to ask him as living knowledge and really solve a lot of misunderstandings, of ambiguities. And he himself is the first to say, I would have named this differently 50 years ago than today. So this has also been a work of many, many decades, annotating.
Brilliant, excellent. Sorry, I'm just scrolling back up now. I think the next question was from Patty, and now I've lost the things here.
The keyword question, I think.
Yes, thanks. So for the keyword problem, have you tried using annotation techniques that would then allow you to extract and cross-reference information?
Well, I think that's sort of what we're trying to achieve in some way. Like Bruno said, one of the problems or the difficulties that we have is that we're really starting from like a pre-digital. There's nothing digital apart from the really old and very summary catalog entries of the books themselves, but the keywords are completely analog. So there's no easy way of just using an existing framework or a system, and unless I understand the question, I don't understand the question correctly. I think that's sort of what we're trying to do. I think perhaps, I mean, initially we also looked at placing the keywords directly into MARC records. We haven't completely discarded that option yet, but I think one of the disadvantages of that is that then they're locked in with the records of the books themselves. And one of the things that we'd like to do precisely in order to cross-reference is to have them as a separate entity that we then connect to the books, rather than have the keywords locked up in a way in the MARC records of the books themselves. So I don't know if that answers the question, but
Yes, no, it does help. Thank you. I was actually asking the question at the same time that you were explaining that. So, you answered the question before already, but yeah, thank you for the extended explanation. That was really useful.
Thank you.
Great. And now on to the next question. How many languages will the keywords need to be in?
Yeah, I think one of the Ton uses, I think mostly they're in Dutch. And this, I think, ties also in. I quickly saw some other questions about using existing thesauri and ontologies, and I think I can perhaps, if we group all of these issues together, I didn't mention this in my part of the presentation, but obviously another reason that we'd like to treat the keywords separately and define them in SCOS terms is that we can then say we can add translations in other languages, and we can also obviously connect them to the terminology in existing thesauri and ontologies. So this is one of the things that we can do by having these keywords as a SCOS reservoir, so to say. So there are several existing music ontologies. I think I saw Mimo in the comments somewhere, and there's other ones for different parts. For Mimo is sort of specifically for instruments. There's other ones more broadly for musical genres or for musical instruments. And there's been an attempt, I don't remember what their name is, this project in France of bringing all of these together and sort of linking them. So there's already quite a lot of work has been done on connecting different music thesauri and ontologies. The thing is that Copeman's, we're not trying to attempt to make like a complete or a comprehensive music ontology. What we're trying to do is saying, okay, this is sort of the system that Copeman himself built up over 50 or 60 years. And we think it's useful for others as well, but we're not trying to create some sort of comprehensive, all-encompassing music ontology. So we do want to connect these with existing ones, but we're not trying to create something that's complete in and of itself.
If I may add something to that, what is also interesting about some of the keywords is that they reflect scholarly quests by Ton himself. He has some very outspoken views vis-a-vis some of the practices of his colleagues. So this is a practice in evolution with a lot of controversies. For example, one is what did Bach's chorus contain just one singer per part? There's one school that really believes so, while Thomas belonged to the other school saying no, that this is not, you cannot prove that. So this one keyword saying multiple use of a score, and I had to ask him what do you really mean with that keyword, and he said, well, this is exactly my point of view vis-a-vis this other idea that instrumentalists and singers just had their own score, and this own score was used for one performer per part. So there's a lot of keywords that actually reflect long threads of research that are unsolved yet, and they're more than just terms in music. There's sometimes even questions in music.
Mm.
Wonderful. And sort of related to that, I suppose, there's a question here. I wonder whether data visualization would be interesting rather than text, like a social network analysis between concepts or something like this, the interrelationships between these different concepts.
Yeah, I think that's definitely what we're also interested in. One of the things that we can do, obviously, when depending on for example, the editor that we use, that we're planning on using for structuring and transcribing the keywords, is Vocbench, which is a SCOS editor developed at the Università di Roma Tor Vergata in Rome, which has been used by the EU as well and other institutions. And one of the display modes that has is that you can display the terms in a graphic, sort of in a graphic visualization of how the terms connect to each other. The example that Bruno gave earlier about the dedicatee, and that there's other books on the same person, on other aspects of her life. So I think that's definitely also something that we're interested in. And perhaps one more thing with regard to the vocabulary itself. As you could already see, actually, on the example of his actual notes that Bruno showed earlier, the list of terms. There's a few examples where he uses like a subterm, or he enters a term and then there's sort of a subterm, but mostly it's a very flat vocabulary. It's just it's a pick list. It's a list of terms, so that the keywords themselves are not highly structured. And obviously, there's things that we could add to that by saying, you know, all of these string instruments are all different string instruments that go under the family of string instruments. But this also could be solved more easily by just connecting them to existing ontologies like MIMO for instruments, and it sort of seems superfluous to sort of do all of this work again if it's already out there. So yes, but the terms themselves are not highly structured, so it's more the connections with the books, I think.
So if I just may add something short, we've also been very concerned about structure of knowledge in our time and in the Baroque. We had some discussions already, Huub and I, about database systems and the way they always tend to structure information in a simplifying way. Whether if you're looking at tabular data, for example, once again, I'm very new to this, but I quickly found out that tabular data, MySQL-like stuff, would not work for this library because the terms are really what you can conceive as monads, as Leibniz comments. So they're all particles in an endlessly connected network. And someone really made a very good suggestion, and I'm actually working on this. I have this on my on my office. Is Neo4j and the graph database. I think this is really more in the vicinity of the way the knowledge of Copeman and the era his books are in, so mainly 17th, 18th century, the way they are connecting knowledge and particles of knowledge, like Cartesian ideas almost, but not in the kind of 19th century taxonomic way, where you have a clear class and a discipline and a subdiscipline. So it's the taxonomy is not so easy to apply on Copeman's vocabulary.
No, in a way, it's the ideal linked data project.
Great. Yeah, and I've just put the Neo4j link down there for people. I mean, it depends what entities, because I wondered, you were talking there about one of particular musicians as well. So what are your entities? Do you want to link to musicians? And then Ben is asking about Wikidata, Patty about DBpedia. What are the entities you want as well as the concepts? But I can imagine that you had instruments, but you had musicians, other things.
It's exactly another thing that we've been discussing, because he, in Tom's own use, he mixes persons with musical instruments and other concepts, more or less abstract, and this precisely this issue of what to do with persons we haven't resolved yet, in part because Tom sometimes adds persons that don't exactly have something to do with the book. For example, if there's an early modern edition that lists sort of on the title page or on one of the first pages the other composers that are also available from the same publisher, he would add all of these names among his keywords as well. So they sort of, we're thinking, well, does that not really, we're seriously thinking about treating the personal names differently, and we don't yet know exactly how to do that. And I think on the VF records, there are VF records for some of these musicians, but also for many of them there aren't. there are Wikipedia pages for some of them, but not for all of them. So this what to do with the persons, that's another question that we haven't quite resolved yet.
And just maybe a comment back about that. I remember from my cataloging days that you can have, if you put it in one market field, it's the author of a book, and then you can have it in the other one, it's a subject of a book. So you can have the differentiation there. So that would be interesting to look at. Exactly.
These are many things with that regard that we can do already just in existing MARC records that don't require a whole separate system. And then obviously these authority records for these persons, we can in some way perhaps tie back into a wider project, but it seems that that's like a lot of that can be done within sort of existing ways that books are cataloged.
Excellent. Question from Joanna. Is there a version of Historical Thesaurus for non-English?
For the terminology, you mean, or the... well, there's...
Sorry, so it was a half-typed question and then my phone cut out. Is there a version of the Historical Thesaurus that would mean that you could use a base set of keywords that have the data from the Historical Thesaurus to see what words were in contemporary usage without having to identify them sort of on a case-by-case basis?
Not that I know of. And with historical, you mean sort of the historical terms themselves?
Yeah, I'll put the link in the chat. It's hosted by the University of Glasgow, the English version, but it's, as I say, I have no idea if there's a version of other languages.
Is that a music thesaurus?
No, it's everything. It's the most comprehensive thesaurus you'd ever want to see in your life.
Thanks.
I like that sound, thesaurus of everything.
Yeah.
And then there's a question, and I think this is when you were talking about that Tom is actually going to be involved in the project, and Ben makes the comment, oh, that'll make things much easier, but I'm just wondering, could oral history fit into this project then?
Absolutely, but it's not that you just have the door and a key to unlock and you find everything. Tom Copeman is a very interesting personality, to say the least, and you often have to trigger him in certain ways to loosen the information. Sometimes you have to really ask very specific things. Sometimes he's just starting to talk, and you need to record it and record as much as it can. So, but he's a musician, and we also try to get to know more of his ways of working, not today, but in the past as well. I've also interviewed a musician who was a student back in the 80s and who co-authored the book on Baroque music he's done then, to get to know how did he work with the books, for example, in the context of his lessons with students. How is he searching information himself? We know that he's very limited in that he always has to ask his librarian where a book is positioned. It's that big, his library. So there's a lot we will be able to retrieve, but I'm afraid there's also a lot that will be locked inside the man, because he's been reading these books in a very interesting way. He's always been reading on planes. He had a case full of books with every commission he did, and well, he's just writing down these keywords. So is this the system? How systematic is it? Is it the flash of the moments that plays a role? So there's sure a lot of things, indeed, oral history wise, to learn from this collection. How he annotated, how he worked. But we're so grateful to still have him and to have his library in its entirety, because very often his libraries disperse all over the world, or you never get to know how people actually use their library. So that we're in an advantage and a very privileged position to work with him directly.
Great, and I see that Joanna has pasted in the link to the Historical Thesaurus of English. That looks very interesting. Does anybody have any other questions for Bruno and Huub at this stage? Maybe I could just have one more then. I just wondered, because Ton has obviously worked with many other people during his career. I wonder if there are any letters or correspondence or any other sorts of additional archival materials that you may be able to add to this.
Oh yes, as a matter of fact, he's been very smart to put in also the letters from bookshops from which he bought the books. So when he bought something online, there's a copy of the email or of the bill. Sometimes he puts some information. He also already alerted us that he bought a lot of stuff from a deceased Dutch conductor, well-known person, I will not name him, who said, well, that person used to annotate very nice things about other people in his book, so be aware that you just do not put everything just public. So yes, there's a treasure of information between the covers of these books, and then of course there's the historical element of all the ex libris that are inside. There's the handwritten dedications in them. There's a lot of acquisition and provenance research to be done. There's some interesting links to musicians which he bought stuff of at auction. So yes, there's a lot of levels of information, historical for Ton, but also for the era before Ton. If that answers the question. Maybe Huub has more to tell.
Well, and it also should be noted that obviously he isn't, I mean, he's still alive, and he didn't sell everything that he owns. He sold, I mean, we acquired the library, but he also has a very large collection of early modern engravings and prints. Many of them specifically bought because they're on musical subjects, so engravings that depict musical scenes or that have some element of music in them, which he still owns. And obviously there's his own personal and the archive, I imagine, and the archive of his ensemble, which he still performs with, as Bruno mentioned. So he's still active as a musician. So it's not like we've acquired sort of the inheritance of a deceased person. This is, even parting with his library for him has been very difficult thing, but the motivation was precisely that he wants to avoid it being split up and dispersed after his death. So that was the big motivation in selling it now, in order to make sure that it remains together.
Wonderful, wonderful. And just a sort of a note on that. I mean, we've got, again, a researcher at Ghent University who does digital forensics on computers and things. So, I mean, I can imagine, because he's still alive, there'll be the last 20 years will be, his archive will be on his computer. So maybe
he doesn't use a computer.
Analog person.
Oh, well, that's even better then. That's easier. Does anybody else have any last questions for Bruno and Huub? I think everybody has asked their questions now. So maybe to say first, thank you very much to both of you for this fascinating presentation.